chair, settling myself, making sure that I'm all ready for tonight's program. This is Beyond the Headlines. I'm your host, Odette Campbell. Last Saturday, it was a very important day in Grenada's history. March 13th struck on the calendar. And this evening, we're looking back to March 13, 1979, the day when the first revolution in the English-speaking Caribbean was recorded and is in the history books, the first and the only in the English-speaking Caribbean. And this evening, I'm pleased to present our panelist, Economist, Mr. Ambrose Phillip, and former school administrator, school principal, Mrs. Glenda Mason-Francis. Mr. Phillip, Mrs. Mason-Francis, good evening.
Good evening to you. Good evening to all
our listeners and viewers.
So, March 13, 1979, for the people who probably were too young to know, or it would have been just a vague recollection, we want to revisit March 13, 1979 and fast forward to 2021 and look at the periods in between. So we have themed tonight's program Legacies of the Revolution, Current Realities, and the Threats. And what we want to do first is to do a kind of build-up. So we have one report where the Associated Press at the time looked back at the Grenada Revolution. Let's take that at this time.
It all began at 6 o'clock in the morning when a solitary barracks guard was lured away by a young woman who sympathized with the opposition party. Groups of men moved in, seized the armory, and took the sleeping soldiers by surprise. The raiding party donned army uniforms and moved onto the radio station. The guards were quickly overpowered, and the first bulletin from the People's Revolutionary Government was broadcast. The coup, which only took a few hours, was carried out by the New Jewel movement. Its members are mostly young left-wing lawyers and intellectuals. The group formed 7 years ago and quickly won widespread public support to challenge Sir Eric Gary's Grenada United Labour Party. Their leader is a 34-year-old London-trained barrister, Maurice Bishop, now Grenada's self-imposed Prime Minister. He told the press what made him strike when he did.
We had received information on the Saturday before the Tuesday that the intention of the government was to search us and detain us. We decided to go underground. While we were underground, more information came to us on the Monday morning that the plan was that Gary was going to flee the country, leaving orders to have our leadership killed. We therefore, around 3 o'clock, summoned a council, a meeting of our top cadres, and there and then the decision was taken that we should move rather than wait to be killed.
The seeds of Grenada's current problems were sown 5 years ago. In 1974, after 200 years of British rule, the island gained its independence and raised its own flag for the first time. But the Grenadians themselves had doubts about what exactly they were celebrating, for the island had stumbled into independence in the middle of a general strike. Britain too had her doubts and alerted a warship to stand by to evacuate foreigners in case of violence. But Eric Gary had got what he wanted and happily danced the night away in the company of his supporters. Gary had an unshakable belief in his own leadership and authority. But for the people of Grenada, the strikes, riots and street demonstrations that had disfigured the island from the end of 1973 were an inauspicious prologue to full independence.
Right, so there we have it, setting some kind of scene for tonight's discussion. Mrs. Mason-Francis, I'm coming to you. Do you recognize anyone in the video? For instance, who was that woman dancing with Sir Eric? Do you, by any chance, recognize the person?
No, I can't make out anybody.
Okay.
I mean, I made out Sir Eric, but the person dancing, I don't know who it was.
Okay.
The first time I'm seeing that.
All right. So, Mrs. Mason-Francis, I'm staying with you for a little bit. Everybody spoke about how flamboyant Sir Eric Gary was. And I guess that just gave us a taste of his personality, didn't it?
Yes, it surely did. Well, again, he loved to dress. He was a well-dressed gentleman, and his favorite color was all white. His suits, his shoes, everything like that. You could meet him for his dress.
All right. So, Mr. Phillip, we had the AP setting the tone there. And, you know, Morris Bishop, one of the words I remember him using a lot was that of the propagandist, you know, propaganda. And these people the propagandist, based on the narrative you heard there, Mr. Phillip, are you questioning anything, or do you think it adequately represents the truth?
Well, I don't know if the AP release could have delved further into what I will call the latter-day Gary. And I have held the view that there have been two Garys. There was the Gary that emerged out of the strikes of 1951, Sky Red and so on. And that Gary was a genuine working class hero who had done a lot for the ordinary workers, especially people in the countryside, people who had worked on the large estates of the country. And that Gary certainly was not the Gary that we saw in the 1970s. That is not the Gary who managed to survive Spondamania and moved into the 70s brutalizing people. And sometimes it is useful to remember that if you learn the lessons of the past, you don't have to repeat them. Remember that one of the things that propelled the NGM into the skylight was that issue in St. David's involving Lord Brownlow on a beach. And today, how many years, almost 40 odd years later, we have people in St. David's making noises about certain developments that the physical planning people and the powers that be seem to be ignoring. And we must remember, as the Chinese, our good Chinese friends will tell you, a journey of 1,000 miles begin with one step, one single step. And while I agree with some of my comrades that a bird or two should not stand in the way of development, certainly there are times when in undertaking what we consider to be essential projects that we can encourage or mandate mitigating measures and to address the concerns of people on the ground.
So, Mr. Phillip, you said
I agree with Jemmy Mason Francis that Gary, in fact, he was a consummate politician. He was a consummate dresser. He was a smooth individual. No question about that. He was a class act. But he turned out to be extremely repressive, especially after 1974.
But you said that there are two Garys, right? What changed him?
What changed me?
What changed him?
What changed him? I think you have to go back to 1970 and the situation in Trinidad at the time. You have to look at the international scene in the context of the role that Malcolm X and others played in the emergence of what you will call Black Power. And Gary saw Black Power as a threat. It is not that Gary himself did not recognize Black Power, but he saw Black Power in a different context. And when you remember the characters of the 1970s, like Walter Rodney of Guyana, and the Duncans of Jamaica, and throughout the Caribbean, I think that Gary, in fact, felt threatened and probably overreacted to the intellectual power as well as the ground reach of the New Jewel movement.
The intellectual power, and let's just, in the interest of full disclosure, our panels this evening, we have that relationship of being a teacher and a student, and then we have the equalization of roles. Mrs. Mason Francis, Mr. Phillip spoke about intellectual power, and Gary probably not being able to stand up to that. And so you probably first want to trace the roots with Mr. Phillip and yourself at the GBSS, and then you could take us along that track where Gary apparently feeling intimidated by the intellectual power of the day.
What I was about to say, something we must bear in mind. It happens all the time. power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we had a case of that in Grenada. And I must say, we also, I think Ambrose mentioned this, we have a case of history always repeats itself, you know. History always repeats itself. And if you were to look around today, different countries, and so we see the same thing happening and emerging. So we have to be very careful. I'll say no more for now.
But in terms of Grenada, we're always hearing when people attach handles, they referred to people like Morris Bishop, like these UK-trained lawyers. Why is that? Why was that of significance or importance in the Gary context or in the Grenadian context?
I remember when we met the last time, I spoke about the Black Power. And it started really abroad. I remember in Canada, George Williams University, where we had, you know, the Black students coming into their own, demonstrating and all sorts of things. This spread to Trinidad, as Ambrose mentioned, the Black Power movement down in Trinidad and all the islands. And there seemed to have been a plan with the young university people. Some were in England, like Morris, as lawyers, some were in Canada, that they would return to their islands, the West Indian islands, the islands of their birth, and try to change what was happening there. Gary was fully aware of this. And this is when he really became, you know, hostile and so on, and did everything in his power to sort of curb and keep these young people down. He was threatened. Personally threatened and otherwise, you know.
So, Mr. Phillip, do you think you haven't...
Let me make the point that revolutions, while they are in the interest and of benefit to the working class, I don't recall any revolution that has been led by the working class. Mm-hmm. Going back to the most famous revolution of all time, the French Revolution of 1789, that was led by intellectuals. It was led by the middle class. It was led by people who gave thought to things. The whole principles, equality, liberty, fraternity, coming out of the French Revolution, which eventually influenced the American Revolution and the American War of Independence from England, was in fact led by intellectuals. And in the Grenada situation, I challenge anyone to tell me that it was significantly different. You would have had people of working class and of origins from the country who had not traveled, who had barely gone beyond the secondary school system, who would have participated, right, who would have made key contributions. But revolutions, by their very nature, are seldom led by the commoner or by a working class man. Invariably, they are led by what the literature calls the intelligentsia. And the reference in the AP clipping to the fact that Morris was a British trained lawyer had in fact to do with that link with the colonial past. Remember who were the leading intellectuals at the time. You had the Frantz Fanon of the French islands. You had the Walter Rodney of Guyana. Walter Rodney wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And this came upon the heels of Capitalism and Slavery, written by Eric Williams of Trinidad and Tobago for his thesis. And these things motivated people. These things gave people a different perspective as to the history that we had been taught in the primary school and in secondary schools at the time. And it formed the intellectual basis for a liberation, so to speak, of the ordinary working man. That is a background. That is, don't forget the role of our own Tubal Uriah Buzz Butler in Trinidad. Remember that Butler was not only a trade union leader. Butler went on to form a political party, although that party itself had not enjoyed a great deal of success in the country.
I quite remember.
So yes, Gary was threatened and could not respond to the NJM in the intellectual fashion that the NJM was able to blow him out of the water with.
So I guess we could continue looking at that. I remember that was one of Bishop's words as well, the intelligentsia. One person here on social media, and the stream is just kicking already, says that Gary was a wicked person as a child growing up around the time it was scary to me as a child. And we have an insert where he made some comments. People were talking about the fact that he had these enemies, political enemies. And let's take that insert and we come back and continue the discussion. I understand that GBSS, McDonald College, and some of the other schools around the island were hot spots for political activity at the time. And we will come back to that. But let's look at that insert, the second report that we have, continuing that AP feature.
The country was going bankrupt, but Gary hung on, and his persistence was rewarded. In 1976, his party won 9 out of 15 seats, rubber-stamping another 5-year extension of his 25-year domination of the island's politics. Also in 76, South Korea gave him an honorary doctorate in exchange for exclusive offshore fishing rights. In 77, the Queen of England gave him a knighthood. Internationally, he's exposed himself to ridicule when giving annual speeches at the United Nations about flying saucers, in which he firmly believes. He's even been called the Idi Amin of the Caribbean by some critics. There are said to have been attempts on his life. But at this press conference in 1974, Gary didn't seem too concerned.
People have tried to get rid of me, and I don't think they can make it. Lots of them who have tried are lying in the cemetery.
How did they die, Prime Minister?
How are they doing?
How did they die?
Natural causes.
So there we have the reporter asking him about the people who might have made attempts on his life. And his response was, they asked him, how did they die? And he said, of natural causes. Mr. Phillip, your take on that?
I am not aware of any concerted effort to liquidate Gary, so to speak, prior to the advent of March 13, 1979. I don't know that bloodshed was a feature of the period. And I am not aware that Gary himself liquidated his enemies. He certainly had them brutalized. I mean, the Mongoose gang was notorious. And there are people alive today who can give testimony to the atrocities of the Mongoose gang, men as well as women. But I cannot tell you that I am aware of wholesale bloodshed, either on the part of Gary or on the part of the forces who opposed him to liquidate him, so to speak. There were certain key figures around Gary who came to an unfortunate early demise. There were 2 leading policemen that I can recall, one from the Birch Grove area, one from the Monjaloo area, who themselves were quite notorious and who treated criminals in an inhumane fashion. Do not forget that we have things like Bloody Sunday and Bloody Monday. And I believe that there are nurses still alive who would have treated the white man, the radicals, and so on, who had been brutalized in Grenville one Sunday afternoon. So, yes, Gary was charged, he was oppressive, but I cannot tell you that there was systematic bloodshed during my knowledge of the last days or even the earlier days of the Gary regime. I cannot tell you that. And in fact, one of the notable features, and this is something that the revolution prided itself about, and that was the relatively bloodless nature of what some people choose to call a coup d'etat and what quite a few of us prefer to call a revolution that occurred or started on the morning of March 13th.
Let me say something. I can testify to both the Bloody Monday and the Bloody Sunday. The Bloody Sunday came before the Bloody Monday. I personally saw the guys after they were beaten and taken to the Salus Hospital. That was Dr. Stan Friday's hospital in Monjaloo. We used to visit them regularly, Jackie and myself. And I had pictures of that, but I don't know, somewhere along the line, I don't know if I put it away so far, I can't find it, or if I gave it, I don't know, but I could personally attest to that, the brutality, the Bloody Monday again that happened. As a matter of fact, I used to be with Jackie all the time, but I was not one for demonstrations. I would meet on a morning. Sometimes we go to school together. When we reach down the alley there, she take the left Montway House to go demonstrate, and I take the other direction down to GBS. You made mention a while ago, Odette, about schools that were involved. And again, I personally could say, well, schools in St. George's, mainly the GBSS and the PBC, those were the main schools in the town that the young students, again, was introduced. And the person who introduced them to, well, all that was going on and so on. I think that was Jackie's teacher, was Jackie Kreft, one of the teachers there, a good friend of mine. And things moved on and so on. The young students became very active, political minded. The new jewel paper was written sometimes. Up here in my house, Jackie used to come to write when she wanted to get away from what was happening in town. And then it was done in the school, printed in the school before headmaster and people there didn't know what was happening in the night. So it was Ambrose, you're laughing. Very, very, we were involved.
Demi is absolutely correct. Numerous editions of the New Jewel Movement's newspaper were crafted and printed at the GBSS. Numerous editions. I remember in those days, everybody was afraid of the Bongos gang. So even the question of the distribution of that paper from its place of production or the place of creation to individuals in the community who could pass the paper to selected persons in the community, it was quite an issue. It was quite an issue. I think that in some respects, March 13, 1979 may have been a good thing. I think it precluded what could probably ultimately have been widespread bloodshed. Because I can tell you without reservation that after the events of Bloody Monday, Bloody Sunday, after the events of March 1974, when Bishop's father was killed at Otway House and the Carnage, I can tell you that there were elements of the NJM who were prepared to retaliate and began preparing to retaliate against the Gary regime. So the circumstances of March 13th may in fact have saved a lot of lives.
So, Mr. Phillip, I want to come back to you in a little bit on the issue of the claim that it was a bloodless coup. But before we go to that, Mrs. Mason-Francis, I
said relatively, because I believe there was one life lost in True Blue. I think there was one.
I'm hearing it was two, but anyway, we'll come back to that. Mrs. Mason-Francis, I heard through the grapevine that apparently at some point you probably were against the student activities and walked out of a school assembly one morning. Is that true?
I can't recall that. What I was about to say before, Ambrose might be able to answer that, I don't know. But what I was about to say, like the Jewel movement, some years ago, I had copies of that paper here. And I gave it away to Marital House because I felt it's something they should have for their archives.
Okay.
So I don't know if they still have the copies there or what would have happened to them. But again, I had my views. This is the same reason, as I said the last time I spoke, I was one of those people who started meeting with Morris when they were discussing the MAP, the education of people who couldn't read and write, and so on and so forth. It was George Brizan, myself, Uni, Teddy Victor, and things like that, meeting in his father's office in town. And then when they started to take a political turn, Brizzy and myself, we withdrew ourselves from that. So, we were there as foundation members doing one thing to educate people who couldn't read and write. But then, of course, the politics started to come in and so on and so forth. And I left them and the same thing. But we still remained very attached. And in the GBSS again, well, yes, I had my views. I was not a revolutionary person, so to speak. So very often Jackie and myself had disagreements and so about how things were going. But again, people told me I had to sober her down. And my husband always said he removed me, thanks to him. I came out of the revolution. Oh, boy.
So, Mr. Phillip, I understand that at one point, Mrs. Mason Francis was your teacher at the GBSS, correct?
Yes.
And did you take pleasure in organizing and giving her headache because she probably could not tolerate the politics of the students?
Well, Mrs. Mason Francis taught principally French at the GBSM. And French was not my cup of tea. In fact, all I can recall about French is Je m'appelle. And that is because it sounded so much like German, you know what. And that is what most of us who did not take to the subject would have recalled. Then Jenny disappeared. I believe she might have gone to Canada, or she disappeared for a while, and she would have come. When she would have returned, it would have been, we probably would have been in Form 4-5, but I didn't. I did first encounter her in Form 1 at the GBSS. And when she came back a couple of years later, she would have come back and found a foment of activity. The first, if I recall correctly, the first students' council in the country probably was formed at the GBSS. And coming out of the student council situations in secondary schools, I think you had something called USS, I think it was Unity or something of the sort of secondary schools, where all the student councils came together. And it was that kind of activism and so on that I believe that the Gary administration would have been very, very worried about. In addition to which, remember that in those days, the cadet corps was your next thing to the police. And until 1974, when the Grenadier Defense Force was formed after independence by the Gary regime, the only people in the country with any kind of military training would have been police officers, retired, not retired, war veterans, and the cadet corps. GBSS, there were what? There were one, two, I think there were 2 or 3 cadet corps. GBSS was known as A Company. There was a company in PDC, and eventually a company was formed in SAS. I believe the current Speaker of your Honorable House might have been one of the leaders of that at one point in time. And the GBSS Cadet Corps was respected. When we went to in those days, your main ceremonies would have been a passing out parade, a Queen's birthday parade, and the November 11th, the war veterans stuff. And GBSS always outdid the police in that. Unfortunately, I turned out to have been a senior cadet officer at the GBSS. In fact, while I was teaching, I also was responsible for the cadets there. And this unfortunately brought me personally to the attention of Gary. But
did the Mongoose gang come knocking on your door?
No, the Mongoose gang would not have been able to find me knocking at that door. By that time, I had learned to be able to take certain precautions against those predators.
Interesting phraseology there, Mr.
They didn't. But the regime found other ways to retaliate, so to speak.
Before we segue into
we're supposed to be looking at legacies, not Jenny's and Ambrose's history in this business. Let's look at the legacies of the revolution.
All right, so we would get to the legacies, but you see, it is important in telling a story to start from the bottom up. And before we segue into a commercial break, I've always heard about this bloodless coup d'etat, but I'll just skip some parts of a piece that was put together by someone, and they were talking about, and we'll start somewhere in the middle, Chalky Vent, who was deployed to drive past the barracks and check the state of alertness, he reported back that all was quiet. H.A. and Gadagan rehearsed the assault strategy. They would drive straight into the barracks, attack and disarm the guards, move to the high ground and unleash their full firepower on the barracks, creating shock and panic, forcing the soldiers to flee in terror. At 0 hour, the plan was executed with precision. And I'll spring forward. So soldiers sprang from their bunks, naked, dazed and in fright. They fled the burning barracks, disappearing into the nearby bushes as it burned to the ground. The revolutionaries seized the guns and ammo from the armory and properly armed themselves. Within 30 minutes, it was all over. True Blue had been raised. The revolution was underway with no lives lost on other sides. But however, we did hear we went to 0 hour. The revolutionaries moved rapidly to secure the high ground. All guns erupting, blazing, fire and fury, Molotov cocktails exploding and starting fires all around. Within minutes, True Blue was engulfed in a dazzling ball of flames, acrid black smoke rising high into the sky. From there, their secret location, Morris and Bernard could see the fire and smoke. They quickly relayed messages, activating the agents in other parts of the island. Soldiers sprang from their bunks, naked, dazed, and in fright. And we had the situation. Let's move forward. A group of revolutionaries stopped him at a checkpoint, and he instinctively reached for a rifle on the backseat of his car, becoming the first casualty of the revolution. Police Corporal Godwin Pisedy was part of a small contingent sent down to find out what was happening at True Blue. He too was shot dead in an exchange of gunfire. Another officer, Constable Barry Alexis, was wounded. The remainder of the squad was subdued and disarmed. So we have that situation where the revolution was under with no lives lost on either side. Hyson Brizan, an army officer, seeing the conflagration, leapt into his vehicle and headed in the direction of True Blue to investigate. A group of revolutionaries stopped him at a checkpoint, and that's where we have a situation where one person was killed, and we did have some kind of injury. So it's really it's not truthful to say that it was bloodless, Mr. Phillip.
I reminded you that I said relatively.
Relatively. And that's a qualifying clause. So you want to skip forward and look at the legacies of the revolution, the current realities and the threats. And what we'll do before we jump into chapter 2, we'll take a commercial break and we'll be right back. This is Beyond the Headlines on GBN Television.
Do you know what time it is? You guessed right, it's detox time again. At Nirvana Natural Health Clinic, Detox Center and Natural Health Store. Purchase our 7-day cleansing pack for only $500. Includes everything you need for a complete total body cleanse. Cleanse your blood, kidney, liver, and colon. This cleanse will help you lighten up and get rid of the excess. Also available are our special product Detox Combo Pack for only $100. Try our single detox products starting from $40. Check us out now. Belmont St. George's, close to the Fall Edge area, or call us on 231-6642, 449-7753, or 418-7115. Nirvana Natural Health Clinic, Detox Center, and Natural Health Store. Detox, your way to health.
A message by the Grenada Distillers Limited.
You want a hand sanitizer to do 3 things: kill germs, be gentle, and to go where you go. You can get all of that in our hand sanitizer. Hard on germs, gentle on hands, affordable. Remember, hand sanitizers contain alcohol. Keep away from heat and flames and avoid contact with eyes. Available at retailers island-wide.
A message by the Grenada Distillers Limited.
Total is one of the world's largest oil companies with a top quality line of lubricants. Total Lubricants has a full product line from passenger cars, motorcycle, heavy industrial equipment, mining, trucking, agriculture, and manufacturing machines and vehicles. Total Lubricants, winning championships in motorsports, including Formula One and World Rally Championships. Total Lubricants are available at all Rubis service stations, leading automotive shops, and distributed by Huggins.
Every action we take impacts the lives of others around us. The Glenda Community Partnership Initiative, GCPI, has been working with Grenadian organizations to impact communities directly. Giving back to communities we serve is fundamental to the way we do business. And every year, more lives are touched across Grenada, Carriacou, and PT Martinique. In education, sports, health, infrastructure, social services, and beyond.
I'm reaching my dreams with GOT. They're the ones for me. I'm reaching my dreams with GOT. They're the ones for me. Since 1983, they've been serving the country, and we like all their financing, giving the people what they want, what they need, what they love. Come and join the family that's here for you all the way, from birth to graduation, your first job to your home, and your car through your golden years.
The GT Credit Union has been actively supporting nation building through its many sponsorships and the programs including Financial Literacy Quiz, Pass the Torch Calypso Program, Junior Cooperatives in Secondary Schools, CPEA, and the TAMCC Grants. The Credit Union has helped many people make their dreams come true. Let them help you with yours. You don't have to be a teacher to be a member. So what are you waiting for?
GUT Credit Union, it's where you belong.
How going on, boy? Hey, good old things. Hey, easy. Yeah. Boy, in line, boy. Your house looking a real good day. Boy, it's thanks to the hard-working and professional staff at the Housing Authority of Grenada. They handled me real nice. They did my plan, they did the construction, and I didn't even have to worry about a thing. They were there with me every step of the way, supervising the job, asking me about my concerns, giving me feedback as the house took shape. They were there from start to finish, and even put the keys in the palm of my hand. I give them an A++ for customer service. Oh, it's people from housing bad, boy. Boy, not bad. Excellent. If you're thinking about constructing your home, why not consult the Housing Authority of Grenada? You could visit them right down in the Sandino complex, or give them a call, 440-1015 or 440-1016. Or check out their website, hag473.com. They go handle you. They go jog your blocks, they go draw your plan, they go tote your materials. Hey man, where you going? The Housing Authority of Grenada is your choice for affordable housing and a stress-free construction experience.
Sissons truly cares about your paint job. We give you the results you wish for. Sissons understands your needs and responds to it.
Get the finish you want with quality that is unmatched. Nothing compares to Sissons paint.
No matter your need at home or on that industrial project,
Sissons has the perfect color solution for you.
Sissons paints for good looks that last. Available at all major hardware retailers island-wide.
Welcome back to Beyond the Headlines. This evening, we're looking back to March 13th, 1979, Legacies of the Revolution, Current Realities and Threats. This evening, we have as our panelist, Mrs. Glenda Mason-Francis. She is a former school administrator, former principal at the Grenada Boys Secondary School, and former principal of the Anglican High School. Was involved in the education system throughout the revolutionary period. And we also have Economist, Mr. Ambrose Phillip, as he mentioned. He had his role to play as well. He was a teacher lead of the Cadets Corps. And Mr. Phillip, we want to start looking at the legacies and some of the current realities. But before we do, we continue to lay the foundation for the discussion. And we want to hear from Morris Bishop at the time, laying out the foundation and saying, you know, he wants no foreign interference. So let's take that insert and then we come back for the discussion.
Holding of fair and free elections, very prerequisite to which is of course a necessary list of voters enumerating will involve in the question of they're about to get completed fairly soon. We know that process will be we are hoping
expects to hold elections.
Okay, so we seem to have audio dropout on that piece, but basically he was being
Mr. Voters involved in the question of they're about to get in.
Expects to hold elections.
Okay, so we do have some technical difficulties, unfortunately, with that. PC was being asked about his plans for holding general elections and what kind of response he was expecting from the United States and other countries, and he was sending a gentle warning that they should stay out of Grenadian business. So, Mr. Phillip, as we look at some of the legacies, the revolution came, Maurice Bishop and his team, the People's Revolutionary Government, they said about laying a foundation, they said it was about the people, it was about creating jobs. And there were certain programs that he put in place. What do you consider to be some of the legacies of the revolution?
All right, when we talk about legacy, I am not looking at all that the revolution did or attempted to do. I'm looking at what has survived. What did they actually do that has survived thus far, and which are of extreme relevance in today's Grenada. And you can broadly classify them as being economic, probably, and social legacies. On the economic front, I believe that one of the most important legacies is the National Insurance Scheme. Let us bear in mind that under the PRG, there was somewhere around 17 or 19 state-owned enterprises, creatures of statutes or companies that were created by acts of parliament. So I'm talking, for example, of the National Insurance Scheme. I'm talking about the beginnings of the Airports Authority, because I do not recall that the Airports Authority was formed under the PRG. The airport at Point Celine, which had been a dream going back to the 1920s, was undertaken under the PRG administration, and the Airports Authority came somewhere around 84, 85, probably with the interim administration. You had the Ports Authority, which in fact was formed in 1978. I think it was the legislation for the Ports Authority was done in 1978, but the Ports Authority itself did not come into existence, practical existence, until 1981. And then you had things like, well, you cannot say that Grenlec is a legacy of the revolution. Grenlec had been preceded by CWC, and a number of economic institutions that operate in the state today, in fact, had their birth or their genesis under the revolution.
Let me come back to you. Let me come back to you, Mr. Phillip, on that. Let me just come back to you shortly. I want to ask Mrs. Mason-Francis, on the education front, education-wise, what do you think are some of the legacies of the revolution?
Okay. Before I answer you, I just wanted to point out that when the revolution took place, Jackie Kreff was not in Grenada. I think she had moved to Trinidad about two years or so before that, and she was working in Trinidad. When the news came out the morning of the revolution, she called me to ask me if what she heard was happening, if that was true. And I said to her, whatever you hear, that is what is happening. Our next question, should I come home? I said, Jackie, you work very hard for what is happening now, and the decision is left to you to make that decision. Okay, we stopped talking. She called me back a little while after, and she said, Jamie, I'm coming home. I said, okay. And that is how she came back to Grenada and was here. Now, for me, as I said, every government has made contributions to this little island that are everlasting. And the revolutionary period was the same thing. There were things that were made for Grenada that we have up to today, and we will have till when. They all made mistakes, but they also did some good things. One of the things that happened in Grenada during the period of the revolution, the IFE institution for further education, which today is known as the Marshall Community College, that had its origin then. Whereas all the Form 6 students from the secondary schools were brought together in one place. Something that would have happened then is that the secondary schools were deprived of their senior people, who would have then been the prefects and head prefects, but you then had to choose them from the younger students in the school. But that, what we have today as the T. Marshall Community College, came out of the revolution. Then we have to remember again that the first principal there was Dr. James de Pitt, and Mr. Brizan, George Brizan, he was the deputy principal of the T. Marshall Community College, which was then the IFE, Institute for Further Education. So that's one plus there. Also, you had in all the schools the introduction of teaching skills for life. Things like agriculture, home economics, building and technology, plumbing, etc. All these things were taught then in the secondary schools. They were not taught before. And if you were to lay a hand on the book, remembering George Brizan, you would see many things that took place and so on in that period. Even sports and games became very important in all schools throughout the island.
So, Mrs. Middle-Francis, you think you are of the view that in the revolutionary period, Grenada's education landscape was, for use of a better word, revolutionized?
Yeah.
All right. So, Mr. Phillip, as we look at Mrs. Mason-Francis examining how education grew and developed, flourished under the revolution, remember things like the CPE program, and I'm certain there's some others that you could highlight, but you were looking at some of the organizations of economic importance that sprouted from the revolution.
Let me add two things to Jenny's contribution.
Sure.
You may recall that during the period when Jackie was Minister of Education, that girls were introduced to the GBSS.
I was about to go on to that.
And that was sacrilege as far as we old boys were concerned. Mm-hmm. That was the worst thing that the revolution could have done. However, the objective reality is that the 3 or 4 secondary schools that have been established since during the revolutionary time and afterwards are all Jimmy was the word where you have both sexes in the school. Co-ed schools. The co-ed education, it didn't just start in the GBSS. It started with what were the junior secondary schools in those days. There was the Boca Secondary, there was the Daly in Happy Hill, and there was Waltham, I think it is, in Gov. When those became converted to full secondary schools, they became co-educational institutions. The schools which have been built since, the Wester Hall Secondary, for example, and the one in Tantine, where Palmer was the name of it? J.W. Fletcher. All of these schools are co-educational schools. And this process of co-education started with the revolution.
But Mr. Phillip, you said you use the word sacrilege.
Hold on. The second other aspect is the question of the impact that the PRG made, and which continues today with respect to providing scholarships. Extremely critical. Remember that prior to the revolution, our students, our brilliant students, people who came in the top 10, top 15, or top 20 in the A-levels or final exams, only one or two of them had a chance to have had their tertiary education being paid for by the state. That is no longer the case. When the PRG opened up the educational pipeline to Cuba, right? In the beginning, we had over 100 and something students going to Cuba. These days, I think it is probably down to somewhere between 10 and 18 students who go there every year. And I am advised that we have had over 450 graduates coming out of Cuba over these years who have gone into medicine, who have gone into sports, various areas of sports education, who have gone into teaching, education itself, the pedagogy of teaching, who have become engineers, who have become construction advisors, right? And the increase in the number of graduates that we've had in this country is one of the legacies coming out of the revolution, where subsequent governments not only sought to maintain that link, but also to expand it by the number of scholarships we see now of students going to the United States, to Morocco, to China, and to other parts of the world. But you just think back now about medicine. In the area of medicine alone, the number of general practitioners, in addition to which the number of specialists, specialized areas in medicine, whether it is psychology, whether it is gynecology, whether it is physio, whether it is bones or all of these fancy terms that these people use. In fact, there are about 11 sub-disciplines in medicine that we did not have people in them before. Okay. Didn't have people. Think about the dragons of today, right? Think of all of the practitioners around the country, notwithstanding how badly they were treated by the Blaze and initial NNP administration, how badly they were treated when they came back, the trouble that they gave them to get internships and to get licenses. Yet, the vast majority of them, over 95% of them, continue to be in the country serving Grenada. And in fact, this is one of the distinguishing features between people who had obtained state assistance for scholarships before and now. People who obtained state assistance for scholarships prior to the days of the PRG invariably stayed abroad. Today, more than 95% of them are coming back and serving the country in one form or the other.
Okay.
So those, in my view, are two of the more critical legacies of the revolution, where education and social affairs are concerned.
All right. Ms. Mr. Francis, we want to come back to you on a point. Go ahead.
Yes.
Mr. Francis, go ahead.
I was about to say, in keeping with what Ambrose just said, the medical facilities and everything in Grenada received a lot of boost during that period. The number of people who received scholarships to go, nurses and doctors, Cuban doctors and nurses came into Grenada, did some training with our Grenadian people here. And all that is still a legacy, just to add a little more to what Ambrose just said. I would also like to add a few things. The Maternity Act, that is where leave was obtained for all teachers, regardless of whether they were single or married. That came into origin, that had its origin then, during the revolution. We also had the NESTEP program, where all primary school teachers received training. Before that, it was some people who were able to go to the teachers' college and got. All the primary schools now, teachers now received training. And we already spoke about the two schools, the Bernadette Bailey, now the Boca Secondary School. And then there was another one, can't remember now. Also, we looked at the co-ed, trying to introduce female teachers female students in male schools and the other way around. The GBSS had girls in their form, senior form, but again, when the revolution failed, that went out. The AHS, PBC, and St. Joseph's Convent, St. George's continued as they were, but the Grenville Convent had boys there. Now, something we must also remember is that, again, during the revolution, all the private secondary schools, like the church schools, became government schools. Government took on the responsibility of paying for their teachers, maintaining the schools, and we had watchmen. All schools had watchmen then, and all these things. Before, there was the denominational schools paid their teachers and so on and so forth. And of course, well, you didn't have the sort of status as the GBSS where you had your increments and everything like that. GBSS was the only government school, always was and continued to be. All others, the Catholics, the Methodists, Anglicans had to find their money to pay their staff and all the rest of it, take care of their school. The revolutionary government took on that responsibility. Some might say it wasn't good, but again, it's a matter of opinion.
So there we have it, a very long list of the legacies, and I'm certain that Mrs. Mason-Francis and Mr. Phillip will have some more additions to make, but we must take a commercial break.
We want one critical one.
We'll come back after a commercial break.
The biggest social event on the annual calendar, Carnival, was moved to August during the days of the PRC. That's where it started.
It's a discussion point that we'll come back on Beyond the Headlines. We take a commercial break. We'll also be entertaining your calls this evening, 440-1252, 440-1252. If you're listening to us on radio and you'd like to call, the number you can call is 440-1252 after the break. Stay with us.
A great man once fed a multitude with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Imagine what you can do today with a Lotto jackpot. Be in it to win it with the National Lotteries Authority's Lotto jackpot of $98,000. Lotto. Play and win a lot of money.
A pleasant evening to everyone. Welcome to the National Lotteries Authority's Lotto Draw number 3188 for today, Monday, March 15th, 2021. I am Anisha Charles. With me this evening is Ms. Makiba Bain from PKF Accountants and Business Advisors, whose purpose is to ensure that this show is conducted in an accountable manner, and the game balls with industry standards and in a way tampered with. At this time, your tickets at hand because you're about to play for a jackpot of $98,000, but first, your free ticket letter. Good luck. Your free ticket letter for this evening is check your tickets. This evening's free ticket letter is A as in apple. Let's proceed for 5 winning numbers. Good luck. First one for this evening is check your tickets in the meantime. First number up is 15. Second number. Second number is 30. Third number up. Third number is 31, followed by 10, 15 final number. Final number is 16. Let's recap those numbers. Check your tickets. First number up is 15. The second, 30. Third, 31. Followed by 10. Fifth and final is 16. So that's 1, 5, 15. 30, 30. 31, 31. 10, and 16, 16. Your free ticket letter for this evening is A as in apple. Congratulations to all the winners of this evening's Lotto Draw. Lotto, play and win a lot. When you play all the games of the National Lotteries Authority, support sports, culture, and nation building. Thanks for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.
By now, you should know that the early bird catches the worm. So, what are you waiting for? Put wings to your feet and head to your nearest scratch seller. For every quick sevens scratch ticket you buy at $2, the NLA gives you 7 chances at winning as much as $7,000. Scratch the entire play area for your 7 chances at revealing as much sevens and win the corresponding prizes. Win easy with Scratch. Must be 18 or older to play.
We support you at every stage of your life.
For business,
for your education,
for your financial freedom,
for that new ride.
Upgrade your life with the Communal. Contact us today.
Get Rubigas. Get cooking. Rubigas, clean, safe, and reliable LPG is the perfect solution for your commercial and everyday needs. For cooking at home or barbecuing, choose Rubigas LPG cylinders. Available in a variety of sizes from 20 to 100 pound cylinders. Rubigas LPG, clean, safe, reliable. Are you cooking with Rubigas?
Get Rubis, get going.
every action we take impacts the lives of others around us. The Grenleg Community Partnership Initiative, GCPI, has been working with Grenadian organizations to impact communities directly. Giving back to communities we serve is fundamental to the way we do business. And every year, more lives are touched across Grenada, Carriacou, and Petit Martinique. In education, sports, health, infrastructure, social services, and beyond.
Do you know what time it is? You guessed right, it's detox time again. At Nirvana Natural Health Clinic, Detox Center, and Natural Health Store. Purchase our 7-day cleansing pack for only $500. Includes everything you need for a complete total body cleanse. Cleanse your blood, kidney, liver, and colon. This cleanse will help you lighten up and get rid of the excess. Also available are our special product Detox Combo Pack for only $100. Try our single detox products starting from $40. Check us out now. Belmont St. George's, close to the Fall Edge area, or call us on 231-6642, 449-7753, or 418-7115. Nirvana Natural Health Clinic, Detox Center, and Natural Health Store. Detox, your way to health.
Welcome back to Beyond the Headlines. This evening we're looking at legacies of the revolution, March 13, 1979, when the Grenada revolutionary regime took charge of the country. This evening our panelist, Mr. Ambrose Phillip, is an economist. And we have educator Mrs. Glenda Mason-Francis. She's a former principal of the Grenada Boys Secondary School and the Anglican High School. And Mrs. Mason-Francis, Mr. Phillip used the word sacrilege when he was talking about the introduction of girls into the GBSS and the whole visitation of the co-ed system. What are your thoughts on that transition, Mrs. Mason-Francis?
Well, if I may say, when I started teaching at the Grenada Boys Secondary School, I was the only female member of the staff. And the GBSS has always been how should I put it, very, the introduction of new things into their system. I mean, they're very proud of their school and all, mayor school and all this sort of thing. So I witnessed the introduction of the girls coming in there. It was not a big thing, not a big threat. Because again, it didn't last very long, so that they had nothing to be scared or afraid of. I don't know what was the problem then. That wasn't a problem for me, girls coming in, because it was supposed to happen in all the schools, but it just didn't happen. Other things happened before that took place.
Mr. Ambrose, Mr. Phillip, you want to expand on your thought there? I see you smiling away.
No, Jenny is correct. The GVSS, like the presentation, Brothers College, did have a tradition of boys. The school song, when boyhood days are over, and so on. And in the same fashion, so does the St. Joseph Convent, St. George's, so does the Anglican High School. They have a tradition of girls, and boys going to those schools in that period would have also been regarded as sacrilege. Eventually, however, I think it may have been Victor Ashby, who would have accomplished that accommodation at that time. But I'm showing you, when I talk about legacy, I'm talking about that which is continuing, which is still present. And I'm saying out of that experiment at the GVSS by the PRG, the 3 or 4 secondary schools that have been established since the revolution are all co-ed schools. The junior 6 evolved into full-fledged co-ed schools. Your Wester Hall Secondary, your J.W. Fletcher Memorial. That is a legacy of the revolution. Maybe without that, we'd have seen a continuation of the convent versus high school, the convent versus PVC, the high school versus GVSS kind of a stuff. And I am not saying it is a bad thing at all. There have been arguments for co-educational activity or co-education long before the PRG time. It's just that it didn't happen before then, and the churches continued to perpetuate the single sex schools.
Okay, so like I said, we have the social media platforms that are ablaze with comments. We'd like to entertain some, and we already have a caller on the line. But just to take in a few comments from social media, Jose Ernesto is saying, Mrs. Mason, how would you rate our education progress after 42 years, and what is different from now and then? So Ms. Mason Francis, you could make a note of the question and we'll come back to it. Mrs. Mason Francis, how would you rate our education progress after 42 years, and what is different then to know? Cyprian Bola is saying St. Mark's Secondary, Boca, Grenville, and Hillsborough were built by the GULP and operated as junior secondary schools. The PRG converted them to full secondary schools, which in my opinion was visionary. The junior secondary schools had a strong skills base. Spiceworm is saying, who remembers getting money every term? That was soon after the element of school fees. And Bob Maris shows sacrilege, true Ambrose, even today. And Ernest is saying it was Mrs. Mason Francis who broke the glass ceiling as a woman. Kudos, Mrs. Mason Francis, breaking through the glass ceiling. We have a lot of comments that we try to entertain as we go along, but let's cross to the phone lines. And we'd like to remind our callers that we would like you to be brief, try to keep it to 1.5 minutes maximum so that we can entertain as many callers as possible. Caller, good evening.
Yeah, good evening to you. And I will take half the allotted time. I simply want to say good evening to, I knew her as a kid growing up, and I knew her as Auntie Jemmy. She was my teacher at the GVSS. In fact, when I got there, she was teaching Latin. At the time, I also believe it is either her or it might have been Mr. Batiste that taught me Chaucer. You need to correct me on that because we studied Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And Ambrose Phillip, of course, we were always friendly rivals. I was always senior to him. We grew up on Third Street, but he was always a little boy to me. He tried to correct that age difference on the industrial level when he entitled me an industrial terrorist. But interestingly enough, having laid down in front of the Bury, I saw him following my steps when he laid down at the bottom of the cemetery. And that's all I'd like to say. The program is really very informative, Jemmy. I didn't know you had such detailed documentation of the revolution. You were always very quiet organizer in the background, steady, stern, but approachable. And that's all I'd like to say for tonight. I'm looking at both of you.
Thank you so much for that contribution. So, Mr. Phillip, we've had this settling of scores somewhat. Ha ha. You label him an industrial terrorist when he laid down in front of the truck and agrees you when they laid down the road.
Resist. I know he could resist, but being outclassed remains outclassed.
Mrs. Mason Francis, you had the question on social media. Someone was asking, how would you rate our education's progress after 42 years, the differences then and now?
It requires some thought.
Requires some thought. Okay.
Yes.
You want to think about it still? You want some time to think about it?
No, I could answer.
Oh, go ahead.
I mean,
sure.
We have made progress in some areas, but to me, in other areas, we have stagnated. To sort of pinpoint and say, it will take a little time. But something else I wanted to point out, again, perhaps that might throw some light on me. When my very good friend, Jacqueline Krebs, became the Minister of Education, soon after that, in that period, the Methodist school, secondary school, moved from where they were on Lucas Street to the park. And the person who started it as principal and everything, he was returning to the States and they were looking for a principal. And my good friend thought I would be a good principal for the school. She called me and put it to me. I said, no, I'm not interested. I am quite happy where I am here in the GBSS. I am not the person taking decisions and in control of the school, though I might have been pretty close to him. And if I was to move to the other school, I can't remember the name now.
Wesley College.
Wesley College, thank you very much. We would get into a lot of problems. And you might have to fire me because it's not everything you all are doing I agree with. And I will oppose it. So that went on for a few weeks, calling, sending people to speak to me and so on. The last thing I told her, I said, if you send me a letter of transfer, you will get my letter of resignation in return. And that put an end to that. That was the sort of person I was, and how strongly I felt about certain things.
Mrs. Mason Francis, as a principal of the Anglican High School, I never saw that in you. Interesting. You always were just quiet as a principal, we thought. Now I know. Continue to look. Do we have another call on the line? We have a caller. Caller, good evening.
Hi, good evening.
Yes, please.
You have quite an interesting topic there. Legacies of the revolution, current realities and threats. I noticed that the panelists are speaking highly of the achievements of the revolution, and they are correct in doing so. However, as we look at the legacies of the revolution, it is important also to look at those little needling things of the revolution that may have brought its demise. I must say that I'm a student. In fact, in 1979, I entered secondary school. However, I'm not sure of the point that Brother Ambrose is making, because a couple of the schools back then were co-ed. St. David's Secondary School in particular was a co-ed school. It was started by the church and taken over by the revolution to a point. So there was some co-ed schools. To say that the revolution was responsible for that, probably the spread of it, but not entirely responsible. I should say, however, or finish by saying that the revolution made many gains, and I'm proud of them. I trust that we can build upon them, that we can look back at them and build upon them. And I trust also that we look back at the weaknesses of the revolution and not repeat them. We tend to glorify things. I mean, each era glorify themselves, forgetting the little problems that they had and not trying that in the future we do not encounter those problems again. So, please, as the program finishes, current realities and threats, I want to hear some of that. I don't know if it was said before, but I want to hear some of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Let me agree with the brother that there were one or two schools that were co-ed prior to the PRGs appearing on the scene. But the reality is that in terms of a policy approach to the question of secondary education, I think it is correct to say that the PRG as a government administration was the first to systematically introduce that. Yes, you did have St. David's Secondary. You also had Shaper School involved that was also co-educational. So I didn't say that there were no co-educational schools before. But in terms of a systematic approach, where policy was concerned, that is a legacy and has remained a legacy of the revolution, in that all of the secondary schools opened since none of them are single sex. That's my point.
Okay. I believe we have another call on the line.
Hello, yes, good night. I just wanted to point out to Brother Ambrose that many other schools in Grenada were co-ed schools. You had Magnolia College, you had Shaper School, you had St. Rose. So the revolution might have tried with regard to making GBS as co-ed, but there were many other co-ed schools in Grenada. I don't think Mr. Ambrose is 85 years old, losing his memory. Probably he needed to have traveled throughout the island a little bit more.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much, caller. I think Mr. Phillip would have clarified the point a short while ago. So maybe while you were on the phone, you did not hear. So as we move along, the current realities and threats, because we only have 10 minutes remaining, Mr. Phillip, as you look back on the revolution, the legacies and the realities, we have the NIS remaining today. Mrs. Mason-Francis spoke about the Maternity Act, where whether you were married or single as a woman, as a mother, you became entitled to the benefit. You're looking at the realities and some of the threats. What are some of them, Mr. Phillip?
The current realities is that a significant portion of the state-created companies of the PRG have remained, but they are subject to challenges. The Airports Authority is subject to the challenge of the post-COVID period. You hosted a program probably 6 weeks or so ago concerning expansion plans of the airport, whether they were appropriate at this point in time or otherwise. The National Insurance Scheme, if we talk about Nero fiddling while Rome was burning, that is the situation with the current government and the National Insurance Scheme. The National Insurance Scheme has undergone a number of actuarial reviews. The last one was done 2 or 3 years ago. And the question of implementation, we need to bear in mind that this NNP administration or the NNP administration for at least 15 of the last 25 years. So you can't put the blame anywhere else. Recommendations coming out of the various actuarial reviews with regard to one, increase in insurance contributions, raising the ceiling for insurance contributions, and thirdly, raising the age at which people retire have been questions that Nero has been fiddling while Rome has burnt. It has reached a stage now where over the last year and a half, 2 years, the NIS is paying out to pensioners, and there are nearly 10,000 pensioners. There are 9,600 pensioners, including myself. So I have an interest here, let me declare it. The NIS is paying out more in benefits to people like me and to survivors and so on than it is collecting monthly from current registrants under the insurance. And if we continue like this, within 5 years, it would be history, right? The government finally moved in terms of raising the contributions from 4 and 5% to 5 and 6%. They raised it last year and then found a good excuse in COVID to have suspended it for about 4 or 5 months. I think it was reinstated somewhere around August or September last year. But if the other recommendations of the actuarial reviews are not followed, the NIS is doomed to become bankrupt. That is the objective reality of it. One of the other threats that I see to state-owned enterprises is a question of governance. the public might be aware of the government's track record with respect to reporting and with respect to fiscal and economic reporting. And a number of mechanisms were established to ensure that the government did a better job in that regard. One of them was something known as the Finance Management Act, I believe. It is probably about 7 or 8 years old. But in effect, what this act does is to remove governance from the appointed board and place it back within the Minister of Finance or the Central Cabinet itself. And therefore, in my view, one of the threats facing statutory bodies, especially those that remain viable at this point in time, i.e., Ports Authority, to a lesser extent, Airports Authority, thirdly, the National Lottery, right? These institutions still remain viable, but I believe that the nature of the governance in these institutions is a threat to their continued existence because they practically can be dictated to by the Minister of Finance. And if you look at go to the Parliament, look at the Hansard, look at the agendas of the Parliament and see how many of these statutory bodies are filing reports that are required by law. They are not filing the reports. The senator who was on a little while ago will tell you, than last you see a report coming before his Senate or his committee from any of these bodies. There are some statutory bodies that have had reports outstanding for 5 and 6 years. Where is the transparency? Where is the accountability in this process? Because if you are not reporting, we don't know what is happening with you. We've had another piece of legislation called the FROC, Fiscal Responsibility or whatever it is that has been, I think it has permitted about 2 or 3 reports. They have barely covered the situation with statutory bodies, even though at the end of the day, the central government is responsible for these entities. And in a number of cases, the financial matters of these statutory bodies, whether it is a loan or whatever it is guaranteed by the central government, and therefore eventually at the final analysis impacts on the consolidated fund. Right. Those are the threats we have going forward.
Good. So we have analyzed the realities and some of the threats. Mrs. Mason-Francis, as we get ready to wrap it up this evening, are you looking at any threats that you think you want to identify?
Threats? What is happening? Yes, I would like to give a word of advice. People in certain positions must know when it's time to pass the baton and to move out. Because we have seen it happen, and if we're not very careful, it's going to happen again. And that is all I would say for now.
A word to the wise being sufficient. Do we have a call on the line? Okay, the caller seemed to have dropped out, unfortunately, because we did have a bit of a lag time. So as we get ready to wrap it up this evening, Mrs. Mason-Francis, there's a question that I'd quickly like to get in from one of our contributors on Facebook. The person is saying, Mrs. Mason-Francis, seeing that you spent lots of time with Jacqueline Kreff, what was her vision for education in Grenada?
Jackie's vision? Well, what happened, the thing that was done, I think that is where her vision came from. She was the Minister of Education, and whatever happened with regards to education in Grenada at that time should have been the main brain behind that.
Okay.
So that I would say that was her view. The schools becoming all government taking control and managing the schools. Then the teachers, and so on. Something I think the revolutionary government would not be very happy about how teachers are being treated now. And very often you hear them talking about the hard work of the teachers and so on and so forth. And yet when it comes to award them and reward them, you have parents running them down, you have the government running them down, so they're like some nobodies. But we have to bear in mind that teachers play a great part in the life of Grenadians and other places all around the world. And very often they are the parents and the babysitters of children whose parents have fallen where that is concerned. So that we should pay some more respect to them and continue to do the best we can to maintain our teaching profession.
And one believes that
one question from you.
Mr. Phillip, let me just advise that we only have 30 seconds remaining, so you got to get it in.
It's not in the context of legacy. It is a context of my own personal experience coming out of the revolution. During the revolution, I felt proud to be a Grenadian. I went abroad. I represented the country, whether it was at state level or at sports level. And I was welcomed. I was respected as a Grenadian. You said Grenada, you said Maurice Bishop, people fell at your feet, doors opened. It is the proudest time of my life. These days are the straight to open my mouth.
Two sharp minds and some very interesting points with which we close Beyond the Headlines on March 15th, 2021. We would like to say a very special thank you to our panelists, Economist, Mr. Ambrose Phillip. He's a former manager of the Grenada Port Authority. He's a former chairman of the Grenada Cooperative Bank. And Mrs. Glenda Mason Francis. She's an educator, will always be an educator, principal at the Anglican High School while I was a student there, and she was a former principal as well at the Grenada Boys Secondary School.
No, may I correct you, Odette? I was never principal at the GBSS.
Oh.
I was just a teacher. I was almost, perhaps like the deputy. But in those days, a woman would never be made principal of the GBSF.
Every time we try to close this off, it gets interesting. No, Ms. Mason Francis, why didn't you bring that in earlier so we could discuss that? Every time. Mrs. Mason Francis, so that means we need to have a third installment with you at some point, right? Very interesting point there. We'd like to thank both of them for joining us on the panel this evening. And to all of our viewers and listeners, those of you who chimed in on social media, a very special thank you. Those of you who made the time to call, those of you listening on Classic Radio, to all of our followers in the diaspora, we saw you online and we want to say a very special thank you. And this is where we wrap it up for this evening. So long for now. I'll see you again next week, God's willing.